Good evening, everyone. I'm Carrie Coogan, the library's Deputy Director for Public Affairs and Community Engagement, and I want to welcome you and thank you so much for joining us this evening. This is a very special event in our signature programming series, and it's a special time here at the library. We're proud of the role the Kansas City Public Library has played, that we should and will continue to play in helping our community to navigate this pandemic, adapting and innovating, and in many cases, even expanding the essential resources that we provide. But we have been anxious to return to more normal operations and are pleased and excited that we are doing that next Tuesday, June 1st, when all of our physical locations will open fully. We've worked diligently in the past year to be open and safe by offering many services by appointment, but it just is not the same as being able to come in, stay, browse, wander around, strike up a conversation, or find help, information, or inspiration at the library. Starting Tuesday, you can again. It's an important step forward, one worth celebrating, and our guest tonight is helping us do just that. Rebecca Solnit is a renowned author, historian, and activist. And libraries, she says, have been essential to who I am and what I write. She remembers wanting as a first grader to be a librarian surrounded by books before concluding that she'd rather actually write them. She stands today as one of our most versatile and penetrating writers, having published more than 20 books on feminism and social change, on popular power and insurrection, on Western and indigenous history, on hope and disaster. Tonight, Rebecca looks back at the influence and impact that libraries have had on her career and her life. And she examines the indispensable role of libraries in our country and our society today as community connectors, as wellsprings of information, as agents of engagement in the democratic process. They are, she says, the last refuge of a democratic vision of equality, places in which everyone is welcome, offering services far beyond the already heady gift of free books that you can take home. It's my immense pleasure and an honor to have you with us tonight, Rebecca Solnit.
Good evening, and hello everybody. Hello Kansas City. Hello library lovers. What an honor to be here, even remotely from San Francisco, for the reopening of a library. I think there's something particularly powerful and beautiful about a public library opening, because openness is one of the central ideas of public libraries, open to all, to make information, knowledge, access open to all. So a library reopening is a library returning to its true nature, its true vocation, its true values, to openness. Of course, we all know why libraries had to shut because of the pandemic. And I know what a loss it was, not only for those of us who enjoy libraries, but those who need them and for those who work in them. I know some of the ways librarians kept them open online or with front door book service and other ways, but it wasn't the same thing. The wandering, the browsing, the lingering is so much part of the experience of the library as a magical space that's been so much part of my life. Libraries now are the great equalizers for those on the wrong side of the digital divide, the place where they have access to computers and the internet for free, and also librarians to guide them. Librarians being people trained to be expert at finding out almost anything. They are temples of openness and equality. They feed hungers that are very real, both for practical survival, but also for imaginative joy. When my friend Amy Trachtenberg did the public art for the redesign of the Vietnamese immigrant community branch of the San Jose Public Library near here, I went down with her for the reopening and heard from the librarians that people wanted to be in the library so much there were regularly waiting lists just to have a seat at the table. People want to be in libraries. And just as I think the paper books we hold in our hands and carry with us will never entirely go out of use, no matter how digital we get. So I believe libraries will serve us beautifully for the foreseeable future. It's an honor and a joy to participate in welcoming the public back to a public library. and a library back to its natural condition of openness. And it's been an invitation for me to think about the libraries I've known and loved. One image that came back to me was in the Buddhist temples on the Tibetan plateau I visited in 2015 and 2017, several days walk from the nearest road. Dolpo, Nepal is one of the poorest parts of the world and one of the most remote. On that place sometimes called the third pole because the Tibetan plateau is so high and so cold and so rugged. The temples, many of them were several centuries old, and they all had the same general design, an altar on either side of which were shelves full of books, old books that were scrolls or the long, narrow leaves of the traditional Tibetan religious literature. So a lot of the population was illiterate, and so these were often old books in the format of those long, flat leaves, handwritten long ago or woodblock printed more recently. A lot of these books were sutras in two senses. The Sanskrit word sutra means a holy text, specifically a teaching of the Buddha or one of his followers. But the word sutra also describes something that's sewn together. That's what it originally means, because these books were originally made of palm leaves sewn together. The words sutra and suture have the same origin, just as you might be sutured together after being injured. So a sutra sews a worldview together into something coherent, something that holds together. It mends the broken world. Whether or not they could read them, they knew what they were, these people who came into the temples to light candles, to pray and attend the rites, just as they knew what kinds of things were on the Mani stones carved with prayers outside. There would be these great piles of stones from the size of a pie to the size of a bed pillow or bigger, carved with prayers of thanks that people had put there over centuries, and this kind of outdoor librarian stone. In a way, every library is a temple, but ours is a secular nation, and our libraries secular temples whose values are openness and equality, knowledge and access to it, and the very idea of the public as all of us included. When I was young, people liked to make fun of librarians as prim silencers intimidating visitors. But leaving aside how often that was extremely untrue, librarians have become champions of liberty and of privacy, as well as public life, privacy being crucial to our liberty. Privacy from Big Brother, privacy from the government. Public librarians were on the front lines in defending the rights of their readers to privacy for what they checked out, what they looked at, when during the post 9/11 era, they refused to cooperate in sharing readers' reading histories. They also proved remarkably adaptable to the digital age in many libraries across the country, and to a digital age that did not mean the end of paper books, but their continuance as libraries expanded to offer books in all forms, including audio and online and digital information services. One of my great friends is Chip Ward, the retired assistant director of the Great Salt Lake City Public Library. He began his library career driving a book library bookmobile to extremely remote southern Utah communities when he first settled there, enchanted by the landscape and thrilled to escape New Jersey. I know from the documentary work of my friend Robert Dawson and my own travels, some of the grandest and some of the tiniest public libraries in this country, that is exceptionally devoted to public libraries as a key part of democracy. A great neoclassical building and a dusty trailer can serve the same high purpose, and those two together constitute a kind of democracy of architecture and access. In 2007, Chip Ward wrote a landmark essay about how he and librarians like him contended with homeless people with mental health problems as a sort of last point of access and a last refuge for them in a society otherwise shutting its doors to them everywhere. The essay you might know was the inspiration for the Emilio Estevez film, The Public, a few years ago. They came up with a rather more dramatic version of how a librarian relates to the homeless and the mentally ill in his library. But Chip wrote those 13 or 14 years ago. Although the public may not have caught on, ask any urban library administrator in the nation where the chronically homeless go during the day, and he or she will tell you about the struggles of America's public librarians to cope with their unwanted and unappreciated role as the daytime guardians of the down and out. And our public libraries, the outcasts, are inside, which of course means that librarians are open to all when nothing else is, which is why these people are there. Chip wrote that 14 years ago. And I know since then, a lot of libraries have adapted by hiring social workers to work with the needs of some of their patrons, just as they've hired multilingual people to deal with non-English speaking readers, blind services, and really come up with so many ways to serve absolutely everyone. These things may not be what they're originally built for, but it's a consequence of every place else shutting out the most vulnerable. Librarians have remained open. One of the other things I fell in love with the great Salt Lake City Library and the main public where Chip was, designed by Moishi Safdie, was that it served all the people who weren't otherwise well served by the community. One of the great visits I had there back before he retired, he showed me that they had just celebrated a drag ball. And I am a San Franciscan. Drag queens have plenty of space in my town, but in Salt Lake City, not so much. So the drag ball was held at the public library's community rooms, just as Diwali, the Hindu festival of lights, back then was being held there. Another friend of mine, the sociologist Eric Kleinenberg, writes, libraries are an example of what I call social infrastructure, the physical spaces and organizations that shape the way people interact. Libraries don't just provide free access to books and other cultural materials. They offer things like companionship for older adults, de facto childcare for busy parents, language instruction for immigrants, and welcoming public spaces for the poor, the homeless, and young people. Because of course, libraries are free in the sense that it doesn't take any money, unlike going and even having a coffee at McDonald's and trying to eke out the amount of time you spend there. Because I live in a city with a lot of fancy cafes, but poor people go sit at McDonald's for their coffee because it's cheaper and they get to stay there longer or feel more welcome, at least in my neighborhood. So Eric Kleinenberg continues, I recently spent a year doing ethnographic research in libraries in New York City. Again and again, I was reminded how essential libraries are, not only for a neighborhood's vitality, but also for helping to address all manner of personal problems. For older people, especially widows, widowers, and those who live alone, libraries are places for culture and company through book clubs, movie nights, sewing circles, and classes in art, current events, and computing. For many, the library is the main place they interact with people from other generations. For children and teenagers, Eric continues, libraries help instill an ethic of responsibility to themselves and their neighbors by teaching them what it means to borrow and take care of something public, and to return it so others can have it too. For new parents, grandparents, and caretakers who feel overwhelmed when watching an infant or a toddler by themselves, libraries are a godsend. In many neighborhoods, particularly those where young people aren't hyper-scheduled in former after-school programs, aka non-rich neighborhoods, libraries are popular among adolescents and teenagers who want to spend time with other people their age. One reason is that they're open, accessible, and free. Another is that the library staff members welcome them. And, so the San Francisco Public Library, where I've spent 41 years, has a whole floor in the main library just for children and their parents, in the same building that now is a teen center that only teenagers are allowed in, or people with teenagers. So, and it's everything. It also has a major research section and archive that I've used writing my own books, along with the circulating books I've used for both pleasure and work, periodical archives I've used, and that divine intervention or invention, interlibrary loan. That means if you're an American library card holder, you can get almost any book that was published in the last 50 years, whether or not your library has it, which means you have what in other countries only people with pull-in universities and great universities might have. So I want to talk a little bit about a pretty normal day for me, which was last Friday. In the morning, I reserved a book online, actually a book called A Story That Cuts Like a Knife of Haida indigenous stories as recorded by an anthropologist in 1900 and represented by a poet who collected and annotated them in this book published in the late 90s. But I wasn't sure whether it was going to show up at the Wright Branch Library before I went away for a few weeks. And so I called the branch library I was hoping to pick it up from that had a copy, and had a wonderful interaction with the librarian who put me on hold, pulled the book, came back and told me it would be waiting for me that very day, which was really damn fast. And I know she didn't recognize my name, which I was thrilled by because it meant I'd seen that she would do this for any library patron, that she was taking care of everybody, which is so much more interesting than being taken care of because you have a recognizable name, which does happen to me sometimes. So then I dropped off 2 bags of books at the Friends of the San Francisco Public Library, which supports the library by selling old books where I regularly donate and often buy back as many books as I donate. And then I came home to work on this talk, and I went back and signed into the library online again to access the Oxford English Dictionary, which I've been doing for many years. When I was young and poor, I dreamed of owning that 2-volume compact edition of the Oxford English Dictionary. Those of you who are bibliophiles might remember it with the little drawer with the magnifying glass inside, so you could read the tiny print on the onion skin pages of this huge tome. So I never owned one, and now I don't need one because the online version works just fine for me. So I wanted to look at it, to look up the word library just to see. Words are like people. They come in families, they have ancestors, and you can learn a lot by scrutinizing their families, who they used to be, who they're related to, how they've changed. The word library, of course, has to do with books, as in livre in French and libros in Spanish. But originally, it's the Latin word liber, which I now think I should have looked up to see if there's any relation to liberatory and liberty. But I didn't. Maybe somebody will throw that into the comments. But it actually has the word liber in Latin means the bark of a tree. And so somehow it's associated with paper. So a library is a sort of sacred grove of these books made from trees, a forest of voices and stories and possibilities. And of course, it made me think of another Latin word, or another word with Latin roots, that in Latin literally means roots, radical. The Oxford English Dictionary says post-classical Latin radicalis, relating to or forming the root original, primary, or connected with the root of a plant, radical, fundamental, vital, principle. So we can see that libraries are groves of knowledge that are both literally libers, as in tree bark, or at least the tree pulp from which paper has been made for the last couple hundred years, and as having radical roots, because they are public, because they are for everyone. And that is a radical thing in the other sense of radical as in daring, transformative. Our word public has 2 particularly resonant meanings, but let the Oxford English Dictionary unpack them. It says French, public, public, adjective, of or relating to the people as a whole. First half of the 13th century in Old French. Official, authorized by serving or representing the community, end of the 13th century. But it also means generally known, first half of the 14th century, open or available to all members of the community, generally late 14th century, public locations, public places in French, open to general observation or view, carried out without concealment. So in general, in most of the senses, as an adjective, the opposite of private. So something that's public is open to all, unconcealed, and for everyone. And I remember not that many years ago in some conservative part of the country where people thought the public and public library was too radical and didn't want that word out there, that it was a kind of radically democratic word. And but that's how libraries, public libraries were conceived. And I believe that they will stay boldly public libraries. So it's a relatively recent idea that nearly all knowledge should be public. For example, Diderot's encyclopedia in the mid-18th century published what had hitherto been the secrets of the guilds for how things were made, how metal workers or paper makers or textile artists, weavers, etc. worked. So another revolution in the Protestant era, sometimes condemned by the Catholic Church leadership into the 19th century, took place to translate the Latin Bible into the vernacular European languages and put Bibles into the hands of ordinary people so that they could interpret the divine word themselves, a movement that went hand in hand with the rise of literacy, and then with printing and the affordability of printed books, a series of revolutions that led to what libraries are, what our reading lives consist of, from a very different past. These book projects shared something with public libraries, a passion for the dissemination of knowledge and the equality and inclusion that could lead to. I used to joke that if you went up to strangers on the street and asked them if you thought that we could own our greatest treasures in common and trust people, not just elites or specially screened people, but ordinary people, to take them home and trust them to bring them back, they'd say, first of all, that was impossibly utopian, and then that was some kind of socialism. But that's what public libraries have done for more than a century in this country. You can go to your library and get Homer or Anne Frank or Joy Harjo or a book on how to train a cat or identify a butterfly or file for divorce or survive cancer or bake cakes and take it home and study up. The first library I remember was the Cincinnati Public Library, because we lived in the Midwest for a couple years before my family returned to California, where my dad had been raised by his immigrant parents in Southern California in East LA. So I remember the Cincinnati Public Library, but I remember it as a magical space full of treasure I couldn't access. And I was in love with stories, but I wasn't yet in love with books because I couldn't read. To be in a library without literacy is like being at a feast without a mouth. Though even to see a book, for those of us who get read to, those of us who love picture books, is to see the possibilities, whether or not they'll open to you. Still, every single time I walk into a bookstore or a library or the house of somebody with a really good book collection, I have this incredible sense of possibility, of the possibility of discovering something I didn't know I was looking for, of learning something new, of finding a new voice. And I'm really kind of in love with the physical beauty of books. I'm going to do a bit of show and tell. I'm too primitive to do it as slides, but I thought I'd show you my smallest book, which is an old leather-bound version of King Lear. My oldest book's a 2-volume set of The Spectator, first published as periodicals from 1722. And my largest book, which is a full-scale reproduction of one of the first comic strips. You can't really see how big it is unless I kind of do this with it. Little Nemo in Slumberland. But so I didn't know how to read. And but I had some sense of the magic of books. And the magic of libraries, that sense of deep time in a library that might contain books hundreds of years old, or in the case of the great public and university libraries, sometimes thousands of years old, of being able to go far from the here and now to enlarge your world, to meet people impossibly far away or long ago, to hear their inmost thoughts long after they're gone. One of my great pleasures when they stamped dates on those little sheets of paper glued into library books, the checkout slip, was to check out a book that hadn't been taken out in many years, or in some cases, with my other great library love, UC Berkeley, for decades. The book was taking me someplace not many people were going, and I was taking it into the here and now, demonstrating for the librarians that there was still an interest in it, and the librarian should hang on to it. I miss those discrete traces of the readers who came before me, of the journeys a single book could make. Sometimes there would be layers of slips on top of each other, and they'd go back a few years on the top, but you could peel up and go back 3 or 4 slips and see a book being checked out in the 40s or 50s or 60s. See, it was like it's dating history in a way, although that might make books sound kind of promiscuous, so maybe I shouldn't go there. But if you cannot read, though, you can open a book physically, but you can't enter it fully. And so, as Carrie was saying, I learned how to read, my mother says, quite swiftly in 1st grade. And libraries suddenly became utterly enchanted forests for me. And I just thought librarians had the best job on earth because they were around books all day, every day. And I thought I wanted to become a librarian. And then the next thought dawned on me that somebody gets to write those books. And that if there was one way to be even closer to books than librarians, it was to be a writer of books as well as a reader of books. And that was kind of my final career choice made in probably the 1st semester of 1st grade, which has made my life kind of simple and straightforward, unlike most of yours who had a lot of plot twists before you settled on what you were going to do, insofar as most people have actually settled. So I became a person who lives by books, in books, for books, who makes books, who searches for the words, stories, meanings, patterns that end up in books or can be found in books. But all through this life as a reader and writer, librarians have been kind to me, and I'm grateful for that. So, and just being able to read books, and pretty soon I was checking out 7 books a week from the school library. And we had a good school library in those days when public schools were well funded. And, reading a kind of kids novel a day and then venturing into adult novels. I was a weird, misfit, wildly unpopular child, which gave me a lot of time for reading. And the world through books got bigger, deeper, better than I had imagined. And the ability to read opened innumerable doors. I went through those doors and have pretty much every day of my life since to live in the 18th century and prehistory, on other planets, in Oz and Earthsea and Narnia, and James Baldwin's Harlem and Elena Ferrante's Naples and George Orwell's England and Spain, Pablo Neruda's Chile, Dogen's medieval Japan, and so many other places, with Carl Safina's albatrosses flying without cease for years across the open ocean, with Robin Wall Kimmerer's mosses, with the hunters and storytellers of Greenland and Baffin Island, with the creator deities Coyote and Raven and old North American stories. The business of libraries is to distribute treasure to everyone and help them open the treasure chests. Another library memory, the bookmarks given away in Stanford's Earth Science Library, where I had a residency a few years ago. Bookmarks that declare, the internet can give you 10,000 answers. A librarian can help you find the right one. But also, as Eric Kleinenberg points out, the business of libraries is to connect people to resources and ideas, to information and tools, to books and big data, but also to each other. The job of the library is to build the networks that build the world and offer shelter to whatever needs it, the lonely, the desperate to figure something out, the wildly curious, the lone. And and I was going to read you a little, I'm looking at the time, I think we have time for a little, from my book, The Far Away Nearby, that came out in 2013, which was so much about stories as traps in prisons, as wings and keys that open doors, the stories we need to break out of and the stories we need to make to liberate ourselves, the things we do with stories to punish ourselves or liberate ourselves and others. So I wrote about that early experience. Like many others who turned into writers, I disappeared into books when I was very young, disappeared into them like someone running into the woods. What surprised and still surprises me is that there was another side to the forest of stories and the solitude, that I came out that other side and met people there. Writers are solitaries by vocation and necessity. I sometimes think the test is not so much talent, which isn't nearly as rare as people think, but purpose or vocation. which manifests in part as the ability to endure a lot of solitude and keep writing. Before writers are writers, they're readers, living in books, through books, in the lives of others that are also the heads of others, and that act that is so intimate and yet so alone. Those vanishing acts are a staple of children's books, which often tell of adventures that are magical because they travel between levels and kinds of reality, and the crossing over is often an initiation into power and into responsibility. They're in a sense allegories, first for the act of reading, of entering an imaginary world, and then of the way that the world we actually inhabit is made up of stories, images, collective beliefs, all the immaterial appurtenances we call ideology and culture, the pictures we wander into and out of all the time. In children's books, there are inanimate objects that come to life, speaking statues, rings and words of power, talismans and amulets, and most of all, there are doors. Particularly in this story, in the series that I, like so many children, took up imaginative residence in for some years, The Chronicles of Narnia. Much has been written about its Christian themes, British boarding school cultural mores, and other controversial aspects of the series, but little has been written about its doors. There's, of course, the wardrobe in the first book C.S. Lewis wrote, the wardrobe made of wood cut from an apple tree, grown from seeds from another world, that when the four children walk into it, opens into that world. Two of the other books feature a doorway that stands alone, so when you walk around it, it's just a door frame and a door. But when you step through it, it leads into another world. There's a painting of a boat that comes to life as the children tumble over the picture frame into the sea and another world. There are books and maps that come to life as you look at them. And there's the wood between the worlds in the book, The Magician's Nephew, which tells the creation story for Narnia. A wood described so enchantingly, I sometimes think of it as a vision of peace still. It's more serene and more strange than the rest of the books with their busy symbolism. The young protagonist puts on a magic ring and finds himself coming up a pool to the forest. And Lewis writes, it was the quietest wood you could possibly imagine. There were no birds, no insects, no animals, and no wind. You could almost feel the trees growing. The pool he had just gotten out of was not the only pool. There were dozens of others, a pool every few yards as far as his eyes could reach. This wood was very much alive. It's a place where nothing happens, a place of perfect peace. It is itself not another world, but an unending expanse of trees and small ponds, each pond like a looking glass you can go through to another world. It's a portrait of a library, just as all the magic portals are allegories for works of art, across whose threshold we all step into other worlds. Libraries are sanctuaries from the world and command centers onto it. Every book is a door that opens onto another world, which might be the magic that all those children's books were alluding to. And a library is a Milky Way of planets and worlds. The object we call a book is not the real book, but its seed or potential, like a musical score. It exists fully only in the act of being read, and its real home is inside the head of the reader, where the seed germinates, the symphony resounds. This is why I love it when people read books I wrote a long time ago. It feels like as long as someone's reading it, it's still alive. And why I was so happy to read those old books nobody had read, that they were coming out of dormancy when they were being read again. A book is a heart that only beats in the chest of another. That's when it lives. And libraries are full of potential hearts that can beat inside your imagination. And that's one of the striking things for me about libraries. They're public spaces for private experience. The people sitting at the same table can be in so many different worlds. This one may be in ancient Rome, and this one on Mars, this one in today's news, and this one in the life of, say, Crazy Horse. I want to end with one more idea. I try to talk about the most urgent issue on Earth these days, climate change, every time I give a talk nowadays. Early in this talk, I began by observing that the word library comes from liber, the Latin for tree bark. And a few years ago, I gave a talk at my childhood library, the Novato Public Library, about 30 miles north of San Francisco. I began, There are ecological reasons to question how books are made out of trees, but metaphysical reasons to rejoice in the linkages between forests and libraries. Here in this public library in the town I grew up in, with the fiber from tens of thousands of trees rolled out into paper, printed and then bound into books, stacked up in rows on the shelves that fill this place and make narrow corridors for readers to travel through. A labyrinth of words that is also an invitation to wander inside the texts. The same kind of shade and shelter that can be found in an aisle of books in an avenue of trees, and in the longevity of both, and the mere fact that both, if not butchered or burned, may outlive us. In the most egalitarian of European and New Mexican traditions, forests were public commons in which common people could roam, graze flocks, hunt and gather. And this is another way that forests, when they're public land and public libraries are alike, as spaces in which everyone is welcome, as places in which we can wander and collect, get lost and find what we're looking for. But since I wrote that even a few years, I've learned more. We do cut down trees to make the paper on which books are printed, and we can do that sustainably with tree plantations. Paper from wood pulp was a revolution that made books far more affordable and possible for there to be far more books in the world. The oldest book I own, which I held up, is from 1722. It will turn 300 in next year. And it's probably made from old linen and hemp clothing, pounded into pulp and then spread out into paper. And it's a very durable fiber and virtuously recycled, but the supply of old clothing was finite. The Chinese had long made paper from mulberry fiber as early as the 1st century AD, ancient Egyptians from papyrus, but the industrial use of wood pulp, which I think could also be hemp or bamboo going forward, made paper far cheaper and possible to produce in volume. But when it comes to climate change, what's really interesting is that a book that lives a long life, like a house made out of wood that lasts for centuries, is a carbon sink of sort. It, like the tree itself, holds carbon that doesn't go back into the atmosphere as long as it lives, because trees are these magical things. They draw carbon out of the atmosphere's carbon dioxide, they put the oxygen back out, and they keep the carbon, which they put into the soil, the beautiful carbon sequestration of the Great Prairies to the west of you in Kansas City, the great forests, or they build their own structure out of that carbon. So a tree is a carbon sink, and a book made out of trees is also a carbon sink. So that's the last magical thing to sort of add to the list of the magic of libraries, that they are carbon sinks and they are keeping it cool for us. So a library is like a forest or a great wild grassland, a carbon sink. And when you think of the old books in them, you can imagine the forests they came from long ago. Disposable paper, short-lived paper, is a debatable product, but a long-lived book is something different and better. So liber, the Latin word from which we get library, means tree barks. Libraries are forests of books that contain both our most beautiful and important ideas and the remnant of actual forests. May everyone listening, may every library patron continue to wander in their shade and bask in the deep and radical roots of so many of the books, and to thank the foresters who tend our forests of democracy, the librarians, and the ideal of openness of the public that has brought all this to us. Thank you all so much.
Rebecca, thank you so much. One of the drawbacks of doing online talks is that you can't hear and imagine everybody clapping wildly for your talk right now. Just fantastic and so lovely. So many lovely things that you said. I wrote down a couple of them. The discovery of finding something I didn't even know I was looking for. It's wonderful. Hearing the voice of someone who is long gone. So reassuring in a way. And I love the internet gives you 10,000 answers. A librarian gives you the right one. So if it's okay, we'd like to take a few questions from the audience. The audience has been chatting away a little bit as you've been giving your talk. one person was commenting on the book slip and seeing someone's name checked out, and it would go back and either see their own name checked out from many years ago or another sibling. It was something heartwarming to them when you just talked about the book slips.
I really miss them. It was such a great little biography of, the books, or cartography of the book's travels, or maybe it wasn't cartography, but it really let you know something about the book's life. You librarians can probably look up, sometimes I can tell when a book has like 48 people have put it on hold ahead of me. I know it's having a good life now, but I would love to know where some of these books, how much have they been circulating for some of the older ones.
Yeah, it'd be nice to have a digital book slip.
Yeah.
So I know you've been dabbling in children's books. Can you talk a little bit about why, or what's been the inspiration, and will you do more children's books?
Yeah, I actually wrote a book called Cinderella Liberator that gives us a kind of Cinderella story for our time. And it actually begins with the two wonderful phenomena. One is my great nieces, Ella and Maya, my favorite people on earth, who, because we're all vaccinated and everything, all the adults, or at least my niece and her husband and me, I got to go hang out with them this weekend. And the other thing is, I was browsing in the Friends of the San Francisco Public Library bookstore long before the pandemic shut things like that down. And I found this picture, sometimes they have books that have so fallen apart, they can't sell the book, but if it's a beautiful book, they'll sell the images from it. So there's a picture of Cinderella as a girl in rags holding a pumpkin in the kitchen that I just thought was beautiful. And I bought it and thought I might give it to my great niece, Ella. And then after I'd had it for a while, I turned it over and it just had a couple sentences on it. It was from midway in the story of Cinderella. The fairy godmother says to Cinderella, "What shall we do for a coachman?" And Cinderella says, "I will get the rat trap." And just those two sentences were so marvelous for me, because we always think about Cinderella, it's about getting poor girl gets rich guy. It's a kind of, it's kind of trashy, to be blunt. And it kind of is about an era where marriage really was what determined a woman's security, future, life, etc., which is not kind of how most women's lives are going to work now. They might never get married or get divorced, be the principal breadwinner, etc. But what I loved about that little passage is that it showed Cinderella as an active collaborator with the fairy godmother, and how much this was a story about transformation. So I thought I would rewrite it for Ella, and then it turned out pretty well. And so we put it out. And the other magic of it was the great children's book illustrator Arthur Rackham had put out long enough ago that it wasn't copyrighted, an illustrated Cinderella where all the illustrations were silhouettes. And they were not only incredibly beautiful, but I love them because a silhouette is not quite so racially determined. So it didn't feel like it excluded some readers the way a lot of old illustrations would be if they were so clearly of, European white people. Right. So Cinderella Liberator came out. It's now coming out in Korean, and it's come out in Italian and French and various other languages, coming out in Japanese. And I've written a sequel to it, which will be out next year. I'm not at liberty to talk about, but people can probably figure it out by looking at what other books Arthur Rackham did in silhouettes. And it's really kind of fun thinking, how do you keep what's magical about fairy tales, which are so often about somebody who's low status, isolated, relatively powerless, and who has to struggle and find their way, and who often finds their way by making alliances with other poor and marginalized figures, and that we think fairy tales are often dismissed, where somebody will say, oh, that's just a fairy tale. But they're often about this very rough struggle and dangerous struggle to become who you're meant to be, to find the people you're meant to be with, to escape enchantment. And enchantment is not a good thing, but a kind of curse. You've been turned into an animal, you've been turned mute, you're under a curse. So I see them as these great stories of becoming. When the pandemic started and we all suddenly had like a fairy tale curse of we can't go out, we can't breathe on each other, we can't circulate, we can't go to libraries. I actually spent the first 4 weeks telling fairy tales on Facebook Live. You can still find them all, like how many of them? 13 of them recorded as fairy tales for emergencies, or 14 at the, on that page, fairy tales for emergencies. So yeah, and in a way, becoming a writer feels like I never grew up. I'm reading and writing and browsing and wondering and being able to turn whatever I'm most excited and curious about into my next project does not feel particularly adult. So I feel super lucky that way.
That is wonderful. I'm so glad to hear there's a sequel coming. So
Thank you.
Seeing that. Another question from the chat is, have you read Susan Orlean's The Library book?
Not yet.
Yeah, we actually had here. She was fantastic. The book is really good.
Oh, she's amazing. Even her drunk tweet storm last year was one of the great masterpieces of our time. For those of you who don't know it, she came home from having slightly too much wine, searching the house for candy because she wanted something sweet and live tweeting it. And it was just so Susan Orlean. It was brilliant and hilarious and generous. And she is a very unmean drunk. And
yeah, it was very funny. And then the rest of it, the story is then she went to bed not knowing, that she had tweeted as much as she did and all the things that she said, woke up the next morning and there was this incredible response. So it's pretty amazing. So what is the one book that you could not live without?
I hate questions like that because I deal with one book, it's torture. And this is why I love bookstores and libraries. And I'll show you, this is one of the five bookshelves or book areas in my house. The bathroom, I think, is the only room without a bookshelf. And, the idea of having only one book is just so pitiful. This is the joy of modern life. Paper is cheap, used books are cheap, libraries are free. I own a few thousand books, and I, at one point, became a lifetime alumni member at UC Berkeley, so I could use a library of 10 million volumes for the rest of my life. So I couldn't live without many books.
Yeah.
I'm on vacation for 3 weeks, and I'm taking I'm not sure. Okay, I'll do it this way. I'm taking about this many books.
And you bring the actual
stack about 15 inches high, which my partner will probably raise an eyebrow about, but he's bringing a bike and a guitar. So, I win.
It sounds like you guys are set for a great vacation.
Yeah.
You've written about so many things. And you talked about climate change but with so many topics, how are you feeling about things right now? We're coming out of the pandemic. There's a new administration. Are you feeling more hopeful about things, or are you always sort of a little worried about what's around the corner?
And we're in such an interesting moment where there's so much visible suffering and so much visible damage, and also so much that's going on that's exciting. And of course, anyone who knows who I am knows that I'm thrilled that Trump is off stage and out of power, and that lasting though a lot of his damage is, there's probably not much more he can do. I'm not one of those people who believes he can run and win in 2024, or one of those people who tries to horse race races that aren't beginning for 4 years. But and the Biden administration has just been much more progressive on a lot of stuff than we expected. We're finally in a moment when a number of nations and powerful institutions are starting to do something that comes close to being adequate to what we need to do to respond to climate. I'm on the board of a group called Oil Change International that in 2016 said we basically need to stop all new carbon extraction, no new oil wells, no new coal mines, no new, fracking for gas. It just all needs to stop. What we have already is already producing more than we need if we make the transition we must need. That was a wild and radical position in 2016. The International Energy Agency, and this is, which it has a huge influence on global policy, basically said last week what we said 5 years ago, which is that there should be no new extraction, then we just need to taper it off and make the great transition. So there's a lot of things like that happening that are actually super exciting. And one of the other measures for me of how much the world is changing for the better is, like a lot of people who are over 30, I've been going back to movies and books I thought I loved from the 80s and 90s and seeing that, because we're better people than we were then. We're much more attuned to cruelty, homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, racism, anti-disabled attitudes, and etc. That you go back, like Purple Rain is really mean to women. I love Prince, but I won't watch Purple Rain again. And those moments, like, I'm a little sad that I lost Purple Rain, but I lost it because we're better people. So a lot of my work has been looking at that incremental change and seeing it's often hard for people who aren't historically minded to even know it's happening, but we're a different country, we're different people than we were sometimes even 5 years ago around a lot of issues, certainly 10, 20, 30 years ago. And I find that transformation, the fact that it's actually taking place and that people like Greta Thunberg and, trans activists and et cetera are actually, often these very young people, or the 3 women who founded Black Lives Matter, are really able to change the world. And that, and this is also something that happened to me that really changed me as a writer, was around the quincentennial of Columbus's arrival was when I really started to see that culture really can shape politics, that what Native activists and historians were doing was going to completely change the way we thought about Columbus and the arrival of white people in this hemisphere. That culture matters and has power and is totally worth doing. And, it may not be measurable or immediate or direct, but it matters. Yeah. So I've been seeing a lot of stuff like that I'm pretty happy about, as well as a lot of devastation and loss. And with climate, we need to do so much more.
You mentioned doing the sequel of the Cinderella book. Is there another book that you're working on that's not
I have a book called Orwells Roses coming out on October 17th with Viking. And it is about George Orwell, who was a passionate gardener as well as a passionate anti-fascist. And it is about roses. And because I met the roses he planted when he was a young man, still growing a few years ago. And it led me to ask myself a lot of questions about who Orwell was, what it mean, what engaging with beauty and pleasure might do in relationship to engaging with politics and violence and lies, and I'm still figuring out how to explain that book, but it's been a great adventure and was an invitation to reread most of George Orwell, and that was a huge joy. And I pretty much wrote the whole book during the pandemic. I started a little before, so that kind of kept me out of trouble during the pandemic. Okay, not that the pandemic is over or will be anytime soon, but I turned in the manuscript late last summer, and then the second draft and the third draft and the fourth draft and the copy edited version and the second copy edited version, and now we're on to galleys, which are the early draft of the book for those of you who aren't in the book business.
Well, I guess I'll end on, and I shamelessly, I'm stealing this question from Twitter. I saw, what would be your fantasy feminist / activist writer dinner party? Or, a writer dinner party of any kind, and the person can be living or they could have passed on. Who would you like to have dinner with?
Oh my God, is this like the one book question? Do I only get one? If I have only one person to have dinner with?
You can have a dinner party, so you can have more than one person.
Okay, Subcomandante Marcos, Henry David Thoreau, Virginia Woolf. God, then it's like James Baldwin, maybe at Leslie Marmon Silko, and maybe Pablo Neruda, and maybe Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and and then I'm like, oh, I just thought of a bunch of guys. I need to think harder. I would definitely like to ask Jane Austen some questions. I would definitely like to ask Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston was definitely a dinner party superstar, I can tell. So, and then it's like, okay, I want to have all the books in the world. There's a lot of people I'd like to have dinner with. Isaac Dinesen, Jorge Luis Borges. Like, people, be careful. You're going to need to reserve the whole restaurant.
That's right. Well, I would love to be at the dinner party. Those were wonderful selections.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca Solnit, for your work and your writing and your time tonight, spending it here with the Kansas City Public Library in Kansas City, Missouri. We're just so grateful to have you, and your talk just heartwarming and uplifting and inspirational, and just really grateful for you. And thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you. Libraries and librarians, as you can tell, are something I'm deeply grateful to and deeply devoted to. So it was my honor and my pleasure. Thank you, everyone who listened, and thank you, Kansas City Public Library, for keeping it public and inviting me.
Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.